I am sitting on the hood of my old Civic at the end of my father's gravel driveway, watching the porch light click off. My name is Nora Whitfield. My mother, Margot, had already turned her back. My father, Calvin, had just told me, in front of my brother Seth and two of his friends, that I had no right to sleep under his roof another night. The suitcase at my feet was almost empty because I had almost nothing. $312, a folded blanket, and a gray wool coat my Aunt Vera had handed me 2 winters ago. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. I drove away that night with a quarter tank of gasoline and no destination in mind. I went down the long, flat road out of Halstead, Virginia, past the school where I had been a quiet student, past the church where I had sat alone in confirmation class, past the gas station where my father had once taught Seth how to change a tire without ever showing me how. The heater on the Civic had been broken for 3 winters. I kept my coat on for the first hour of the drive. By the second hour, I was shaking, and I pulled into a motel outside Raleigh that charged $48 a night and slept on top of the comforter because underneath it smelled like a stranger. It was the end of February. I had just turned 26 the week before, on a Tuesday that no one in my family remembered. Calvin Whitfield was not, by his own description, a cruel man. He was, in his own telling, a man who valued clear rules and steady work. He had built the house on Ridgeway Lane by hand, with a brother he had not spoken to in 19 years, and he ran the small HVAC company my grandfather had started in 1978. Seth was his favorite the easy way, not with speeches, but with the simpler currency of being handed the keys to the truck on his 16th birthday, while I was handed a vacuum cleaner for my 17th. My mother never said this was unfair. She said, in the careful voice she had used for as long as I could remember, that life was not always an even floor, and that I should learn to be grateful regardless. When I packed my suitcase that night, Margot stood at the kitchen window with her arms crossed and watched me fold the coat into thirds. She did not say a single word. I had been living at the house for 2 years after college, working as a file clerk at a tax office in town for $16 an hour, saving nothing. Seth had been at the house for 9 months after a semester at a community college that ended badly, and not once had he paid a single bill. Calvin had, of course, fed him. Calvin had, of course, given him money for guitar strings and a new pair of boots, and the second half of his car insurance. Seth had driven my father's truck to my father's house every evening, and my father had not once asked him where he was going in the morning. It was not the tires Seth was changing in the gas station lot. It was the order of the household. Calvin had been telling me, in his small, quiet way, who counted and who did not. I was asked where I was going that night. That was the moment that broke something in me that had been bending for 22 years. I did not shout. I did not cry in front of them. I carried the suitcase out to the Civic and set it in the back seat with the blanket on top and the coat folded over it. I closed the door as quietly as I could. From the kitchen window, I could see the shape of my mother's shoulders, just barely turning toward me and then turning away again. My father had already gone to bed. It rained on the drive to Raleigh, the kind of thin Virginia rain that makes headlights bleed into one another. I stopped at a closed gas station and stood under the small awning for 10 minutes because I did not know where to go next, and a woman in a sedan slowed and asked if I needed help. I told her no, thank you. I told her I was fine. I told her I was on my way to my sister's place, which was a lie, because I did not have a sister. Then I went back to the car and I kept driving. A few weeks later, something unexpected arrived in the mail at my motel address. It was a letter from my Aunt Vera, written on her own stationery, with only 3 sentences. She said she had watched me leave the driveway on Ridgeway Lane and that she was sorry. She said she had mailed me a check for $240. She said that I should not try to be anyone but who I was. I sat on the motel bed that night for a long time and read the letter again. I did not cry. I had been done crying about my father by then. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The first thing I did was take a job at a small bookkeeping office in Raleigh, run by a woman named Marin Holloway, who had once been a client of my father's HVAC company for a single season 20 years earlier. Marin paid me $14 an hour to start. The office was the second floor of an old hardware store, with thin walls and a radiator that clicked twice every hour. I bought a yellow legal pad with some of the money Vera had sent me. I filled it in 3 months with every number on every page I did not understand. I filled a second one before that first winter was out. By the end of my first year, Marin was sitting me down to read a balance sheet, and I had stopped sleeping in the motel. I had rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery for $640 a month, and the first thing I bought for it was a small wooden chair from a thrift store for $8. I sat in that chair for the rest of that winter, eating bread toasted from the bakery downstairs, and I learned what every line on a financial statement meant. I was there for 2 years before I got my real estate license. I was 28. I was also, for the first time in my life, on time for my own rent. That is a small sentence and a very big thing to me. People who have always had a place to sleep do not know how loud a paid rent is. People who have worried, even for one night, that they might sleep in their car know exactly how loud it is. What I learned the following year changed everything. Marin called me into her office on a Tuesday in May and closed the door. She had been quiet for a week, she said, because she had been waiting on a phone call. The phone call had come in. A small commercial building on the edge of the historic district had come onto the market at a price that did not make sense, $212,000 for a property that had been valued at almost $300,000 just 2 years earlier. Marin had already walked it with me. Marin had already shown me the foundation. Marin had already shown me how the numbers could work, honestly, if I worked them honestly. She said, "You can buy this, Nora, and you can fix it, and I will help you with the loan paperwork, and you can do this slowly." I did not sleep that night. I signed the papers 4 days later with $12,000 of my own savings and a small loan from a credit union where I had been a member for less than 2 years. That first building taught me how to fix an old wall. It taught me how to negotiate a contractor who was a year too old and a year too tired. It taught me how to read a tenant's ledger in the dark of an empty hallway. It did not make me rich. It made me useful. And after a year of working on the building on the side of every bookkeeping day, I sold it for a profit of $28,400. I did not call my father. I did not call Seth. I called Vera and said thank you. And Vera, who was 81 years old and did not always hear well on Tuesdays, said, "I am very glad you are still here." I bought my second building in the autumn of the year I turned 32. I bought my third when I was 34. By the time I turned 36, I had 4 buildings on my small ledger, 3 tenants, and a savings account with a number in it that I had never been able to imagine when I was sleeping in the $48 motel room. I paid off the loan on the first building 8 months early, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. On the morning of my 44th birthday, I was sitting in the kitchen of the small house I had bought on the south side of Raleigh, the first house I had ever owned. 2 bedrooms and an oak tree in the front yard, and a screen door that did not always shut. And I opened a letter from my mother. She wrote in her careful handwriting that my father had been unwell, that Seth had moved back into the family home in Halstead for a 3rd time, that my father was no longer running the HVAC company, that Seth was running it badly, and that the house on Ridgeway Lane was going to be sold to a developer who had been circling for years. She said in the last line that I should come home for a weekend and that she would put clean sheets on the bed in my old room. She said she was sorry. She said it the way Margot said everything, carefully, and only once, and clearly. I did not respond to that letter for 3 weeks. Then, on a Thursday, I drove the 2 hours and 45 minutes back to Halstead for the first time in 18 years. The town was older. The hardware store on Route 17 had been repainted green. The church where I had been a quiet confirmation student had a new roof. The school had been renamed. My father was thinner. He sat on the porch in a flannel shirt he had once worn to a Thanksgiving dinner, and he did not stand up when I came up the steps. He said, "You came." I said, "I did." He did not say, "I was wrong." He did not say, "I am sorry." He said instead, "How do you like your work?" I told him I had bought a small house on the south side of Raleigh, and that I had 4 buildings and 3 tenants and a savings account and a cat called Winslow. He nodded slowly. He did not ask me to come inside. He did not ask me to stay for dinner. He asked me, after a long pause, whether I would help him read a piece of mail from the developer. I said yes. I read it with him on the porch. The developer had offered $942,000 for the house and the lot and 3 weeks to sign. I walked into the kitchen where Margot was washing a coffee cup. I did not say, "Do you remember when you watched me walk out the door with a suitcase?" I said, "The offer from the developer is low." I said, "If you hold it for 2 months, I have a friend who will give you a fair appraisal." I said, "Do not sign the developer letter." Margot nodded once, the careful nod, and she said very quietly, "I will not." Seth arrived at the house while I was still standing in the kitchen. He was 37 and looked 45. He said, "Hello, Nora." He said, "I did not know you were coming." He said with a small laugh, "I hope I am not in the way." I said, "You are not in the way." I said, "I am here for our parents." I said, "I am not here for you." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I know. There are people who have been told, by the people who were supposed to believe in them, that they were the failure of the family. You can hear that sentence 50 times, and you think you have recovered from it. Then a phone rings one morning on your 44th birthday, and the morning sounds different, and you stop moving for a moment in your own kitchen. The next morning, before I drove back to Raleigh, I sat on the front steps of the house on Ridgeway Lane with a cup of coffee from the kitchen. There had been a light rain in the night, and the driveway still smelled of it. The yard was the same yard. The mailbox was the same mailbox. The driveway had been repaved twice, but the shape was the same shape. It was a cool morning in early spring, and the leaves on the maple out front were just beginning to come in. I heard Seth drive away in his truck. I heard my father cough once inside. Margot came out with another cup of coffee and asked if I wanted sugar. I said no. We sat on the steps together for 15 minutes. She did not say she had missed me. She did not say anything. She did not need to. When I stood up to leave, my father came to the door. He had a checkbook in his hand. He said, "I would like to pay you back for a thing I should have paid for a long time ago." I said, "What thing?" He said, "I should have paid for your college." I did not want the money. I told him I did not need the money. I told him to keep the money. I told him I had come because I was invited and because his health was not what it had been. I told him I was not there to collect anything from him. He put the checkbook away. He said, "I see." He said after a long breath, "I have been wrong about you for a long time, Nora." I said, "Thank you for saying that." He said, "I do not know if I can say it more than once." I said, "Once is enough." A few weeks later, something else arrived in the mail. It was a copy of the appraisal that my mother's friend, a quiet and careful woman named Eve Dyson, had written for the Ridgeway Lane property. The number on that appraisal was $986,000. The developer letter had offered $942,000. The $44,000 difference was, of course, the exact amount of money my father had been about to lose. Seth was copied on the appraisal. Seth was copied because Seth had been managing the company, Seth had been planning to sign on his father's behalf because Calvin could no longer read small print without effort. Seth had planned to take his cut. Seth had not planned for me to drive back to Halstead for 28 hours. I do not know what Seth said to my father in the weeks that followed. I do not know what my mother said in those weeks either. I do know that the developer letter was not signed. I do know that the property was listed with Eve Dyson at $986,000. I do know that, 3 months later, the property sold. I do know that the small profit from the sale was not mine. It was theirs. I had only asked my mother to wait. I am 44 years old now. I am sitting on the screened porch of the house I paid for, with a coffee in my hand and Winslow on the bench beside me. The oak in the front yard has come in fully this year. There is a hill just down the street, and on the top of that hill there is a small house that I rebuilt from the foundation up, and the people in the houses below it wake up every morning and see the roofline through their kitchen windows. Across the street from that hill, in a cottage sandwiched between 2 older trees, my Aunt Vera lives in her 87th year and writes me 1 letter every 3 weeks. She does not put a return address on the envelope anymore. I can tell from the handwriting before I open it. The truth does not always arrive when you want it. It arrives when it is ready. I went back to Halstead twice more in the last 28 months. I go for my mother. I go for the oak tree in front of my old bedroom window. I do not go for my father, and I do not go for Seth, although on the second trip I did sit on the porch with Calvin for 45 minutes while he told me about the time he and his brother Frank had built the original chimney by hand in 1981. I did not interrupt him. I did not say, "You owe me." I did not say, "I forgive you." I said, "That must have been a long winter." He nodded. He put his hand very gently on the porch railing, and he did not let go of it for the rest of the visit. My father will not change. He will not write a letter on his own. He will not call me on a telephone he never learned to use properly. He has said once that he was wrong, and he has said it again when I was leaving on the second trip, and I expect it will not happen a third time. And that is the end of what I need from him. The house I rebuilt on the hill is not a mansion. It is 2 bedrooms and a covered porch, and a stone walk up to a wooden door. It is the house my grandmother would have liked. It is the house I would have liked my father to know how to recognize. The people who wake up and see that roofline every morning are not staring because I want them to stare. They are staring because it is there. It was always there. It just had not been built yet. I was not there to fight. I was not there to argue. I was there to read 1 piece of mail with my mother and to be still. I was there to build, slowly, the part of my life that no one had been willing to build with me. The last thing I do each night, on the porch of my own house, is to look at the street light on the corner of my block and to take 1 slow breath. That street light is mine. That air is mine. That decision is mine. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. I still do not.